Among the most popular and enjoyed concept in fiction is that of the superhero, the idea that someone with powers and abilities beyond the human norm is capable of standing up and protecting everyone from the evils of the world. From the comic book heroes of DC and Marvel, to even the made-for-TV champions like Kim Possible and the Powerpuff Girls, there's plenty of superpowered action to go around, and nearly every major network has had its own at one time or another. Except one. While Nickelodeon is no stranger to superheroes, for the longest time, they never really play the idea straight. It's either fantasies like Quail Man from the original Doug cartoon, or comedies like Action League Now, poking fun at the idea of superheroes, but never truly embracing them. The closest that we got was a certain robot girl later on, but even she tended to be more slice of life than superheroics as they focused on the problems of a young teenage girl, albeit in robot form. And though the network would eventually own the likes of Power Rangers and the Ninja Turtles, it wasn't until 2004 that they got a real proper superhero in the ghost-themed Danny Phantom.
He's a phantom.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. Before we get into anything about Danny Phantom, there's two things I'm wanting to mention straight up front. First off, I'm not a fan of Butch Hartman. While the man isn't anywhere near as bad as, say, J.K. Rowling when it comes to retroactively changing his series, and overall just being scummy online, he's done enough that I'm not going to be saying much about him unless it directly involves the show itself. Simple as that. The second thing I'm going to mention is the fact that if you're not a fan of Danny Phantom or watched Nickelodeon at this time, then there's a chance you only might be familiar with the show thanks to Randy Stair, someone who became obsessed with one singular aspect of the show and, thanks to their own mental issues, ended up killing 3 people before taking their own life. I'm not going to be talking about this anymore beyond acknowledging it exists. Fascinating Fiction has always been more about the shows themselves, about what went into making them and my own personal thoughts about the content. While I can and have talked about negative aspects before, I generally try to keep it within the line of the show itself. The events of Randy Stair are another thing entirely, and I honestly don't think that I'm all that well equipped to talk about something as serious as that, with the only reason I'm even bringing it up is because I felt like it needed to be addressed that it happened. If y'all are curious to know more about it, there are other YouTubers who have gone into further detail about it, but I suggest keeping in mind that there isn't a happy ending for that story. Here though, we're going to be talking about the show itself, not what one fan of it did. We good? Moving on then. Now, Danny Phantom, even if he's the first real superhero that Nickelodeon had in the traditional sense, is still a Nicktoon at heart. What I mean by that is that thanks to the focus of Danny Phantom's network, especially with the likes of SpongeBob and Butch's other work in Fairly Odd Parents, there are a lot of elements of the show that are geared towards comedy. Constant jokes fill the episodes, often at the expense of other characters. Which actually brings up the interesting fact that Danny was intended for a bit more of a mature audience when it came to its design, despite that comedic focus. Part of this came from the slightly more serialized storytelling, something that Nickelodeon tended to avoid when it came to most of their shows. While other shows had continuity here or there, Danny Phantom was among the earliest to actually have events from one episode being related or referenced to another one, the show itself being a full year before Avatar: The Last Airbender would show Nickelodeon that they could have cartoons that told full-on stories. This is something that we see as early as the first episode, where we start things off with Danny already having his powers for at least a few weeks now. The only real exposure we get to how Danny gets his powers from this first season is the theme song. Yes, the good old days of the main theme song for a cartoon being exposition for the audience as well, which in this case boils down to parents are ghost-obsessed inventors, made a portal into the afterlife, made it so that the on button for said portal was inside of it, Danny turns it on by accident, boom, he's half ghost. This is what I meant before about how the show was designed to try and get a laugh out of the audience no matter what, with everyone seeing it the most with Danny's parents, or more accurately, Danny's dad, giving off the whole absent-minded professor-style vibes. Jack Phantom here is able to make a whole bunch of things that are able to interact with ghosts, while, at least at the start of the series, having no proof that they exist or know how any of his inventions work.
It releases ghosts into our world whether I wanted to or not. Someday, I'll figure out how that works too.
This is a running theme for a lot of cartoons of this era, and especially anything that Butch Hartman had a hand in, making it so that the adults of the series were of little help, importance, or even intelligence. Very few characters that were adults were ever treated as having any real thoughts in their heads, and it usually was the villains. Though even some of the villains weren't really that smart.
I am the Bax Ghost!
I will say that villains and the growth of Danny's powers are probably one of the best things about the show as a whole, especially in this first season. From that first episode where Danny can barely control his powers, even having them deactivate in the middle of a fight, we slowly see him grow and develop, learning new powers as he goes on. It serves as a good way to introduce us to what Danny can do as a whole, while making sure that he's not taking down his villains with little issue. The villains themselves are also a lot of fun, running the gambit of either being completely silly, like the Box Ghost and the Lunch Lady, to being quite serious, such as Walker and Skulker. And it's mentioning our Robo Ghost Hunter here that I've got to address the elephant in the room, one that I think becomes pretty obvious to a lot of folks once they really start getting in deep with Danny Phantom. And that's the fact that a lot of elements are point for point pulled from Spider-Man. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. Humanity has a long history about taking inspiration from other ideas to tell their own original stories, with the idea itself being older than the written word. And even if they're based off of another idea, this doesn't mean it can't be fantastic. Hell, Steven Universe took its version of fusion, Dance and All, from Dragon Ball Z, and was able to do its own thing with it. It's just that when you isolate some of the main aspects of Danny in his show, that you realize just how much in common he's got with the web crawler. Both characters start out as young teens, given superpowers by scientific experiments that gave them the native abilities of a spider or ghosts respectively. Both are quipping jokesters, rarely if ever being violent with their villains and often trying to de-escalate the situation. High school is a major setting, with Danny and Peter both having a bully that would often make their lives miserable. A bully, by the way, that is named Dash for Danny and Flash for Peter. Skulker here is basically a robot version of Kraven the Hunter, and one of the biggest villains in the show is someone who has all of Danny's powers, but use them for personal gain and evil rather than heroics, similar to how Venom was first starting out. Again, this isn't a bad thing. To give you another example, Darkwing Duck copies Batman's book a lot closer than Danny does with Spider-Man, but that doesn't lessen how enjoyable his show was. Using inspiration to help develop your characters isn't a bad thing in the slightest. It's how the story is told that matters. I just couldn't stop seeing the obvious allusions to Spidey once I really started digging into it. And it doesn't help when the show is willing to go and make its own parody versions of popular characters themselves, as they do in a later episode by making both a Men in Black and a Scooby-Doo parody in one episode. The episodes themselves are generally alright, though it depends on just how much the comedy of the series either gels or gets in the way of the superheroics, as well as what the episode's focus is generally on. For those of you who watched the episode I did on Troll Hunters, you might remember when I talked about how that show had a lot of elements from it that felt like those old school traditional TV plots. Things like having the main character having their emotions split from their body and stuff like that. Danny does a lot of these things in nearly every episode as well, but whereas Troll Hunters tended to play the idea fairly by the book, Danny Phantom ends up putting just enough of a unique spin on the idea to keep it from feeling like it's the exact same plot we've seen a million times before. Let's actually take one of the weaker episodes of the first season, Splitting Images, as a proper example. In it, Danny ends up meeting with a ghost called Poindexter that learns about the ghost's ability to overshadow people, which is basically possession. You get a fairly run-of-the-mill plot for the episode where people are seeing Danny act differently from normal, but they don't understand or guess that it's really Poindexter. What makes this stand out from other possession stories is both the fact that the events play out like a body swap tale, where Danny and Poindexter are switching places, and the fact that Danny is stuck within an alternate past version of his school while being Poindexter. The ghost elements are actually a big reason for why a lot of the stories can feel a bit more original than others of its ilk, because they're able to use their own lore and ideas to help make them come across different enough to be interesting. But that's actually where we run into some of the problems with the series as a whole, and this Poindexter episode actually causes part of it. It's here where I gotta bring up the fact that about partway through the series, and much more often after the series ended, Butch Hartman would establish the fact that the ghosts were never really ghosts. They were instead monsters from another dimension. And while there are some ghosts that were clearly designed with that idea in mind, a lot of the earlier season spirits are clearly that, the souls of others who have passed on. I heard part of this change was something that also came down from Nickelodeon, but I don't know how far that actually went. We also gotta talk about the fact that while Butch is still credited with the creation of Danny and his friends, it's believed by most fans that a lot of the credit should go to Steve Marmel. Steve was not only the major developer of the show, but he is credited with taking part of the writing and story in the vast majority of the first 2 seasons, eventually leaving after the first episode of season 3, which is a beast all of its own. Needless to say, because of Marmel's hand in the show is so strong, a lot of people believe the success of Danny belongs more to him than anything Butch Hartman ever did. The actual validity of that is up in the air though, and as far as I know, Marmel's never said much about the amount of control he had over the show himself. Which leaves us with the actual content of the show, and I've gotta say that after rewatching it, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag than I remember from when I watched it when I was younger. I mean, the action itself is still pretty good, as are the animation and some of the storylines, but it wasn't until this rewatch that I realized exactly what is the weakest part of the show as a whole: its characters. Now, don't misunderstand me, the cast is alright, and for a show that's trying to make you laugh as much as it's trying to set up its action pieces, it does its job. But it's a show that's built on stereotypes, and it really becomes apparent for every character that isn't Danny himself. The popular kids of Casper High, which in most episodes boils down to Dash and Paulina, are portrayed as shallow, vapid, and incapable of interests outside of their own. Danny's friends, Sam and Tucker, never go beyond their personal interests, and get to the point where they're willing to take full advantage of the situation of the episode and Danny's powers to actually push their own narrative or ideals. And all of the adults are shown to either be completely out of touch with the kids, or often being the punchline of jokes themselves. This actually brings me to my biggest problem that I had rewatching this series, and that's just how mean-spirited it is, if you pardon the pun. While it makes sense for some of the kids to be snippy at each other, especially if they're on opposite sides of the popularity spectrum, there are times where the jokes and insults made between characters go beyond the pale and dip into feeling like insults more designed to get a quick laugh out of the audience than anything that would actually matter.
What's she doing here? She can't be here to play.
Oh, because I'm a girl?
But we're way more cool than you two.
Tucker, I hope we can still be friends.
I do feel like this is a holdover from Fairly Odd Parents, both being a Butch Hartman cartoon, as well as having Steve Marmol having a major hand with that show as well. You only need to see a few episodes of The Fairies to know just how much of it doesn't care about making any of its cast look like half-decent people. If Danny's show was more like Odd Parents, where everything reset back at the start of the next episode, then some of this cruel humor could actually work, since it's more about making you laugh than getting you invested in the characters. But that's the problem. It doesn't. And having a more serious tone and continuity makes it all that much harder to care about some of the characters when they can't go 2 minutes without being entirely insulting. This, of course, could just be a me thing, especially since I know that jerk characters are among my least favorite characters in any story, even if they've got good reasons to be doing it. At its heart, Danny Phantom gave us a true Nickelodeon superhero, doing what he could to fight off the ghosts of his town and keep people safe. This first season, while mostly containing standalone episodes, had enough of an ongoing plot in the background that made you interested to see who would return from his collection of rogues, and even interested in seeing more being developed. While not the biggest of hits when it came to Nickelodeon, Danny showed us just what would happen if you gave a series a ghost of a chance. With all that said, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best to do so again in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all the other things that gives us YouTubers life. If you wish to support me a bit more, I do have a Patreon where you can get access to bonus content. But until next time, stay frosty.